Brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa salatu wa salamu ala ashraf al-anbiya wal mursaleen. Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Thank you all for joining us this evening, on this blessed evening of Jum'ah, to stay committed to our classes that we are having on the history of racism and resistance in America. And we are privileged again to have with us this evening Professor Saeed Khan, who will be talking with us about immigration and how that relates to the topic. But just be calm and keep your cool during the class, God willing. I assure you that there's not going to be an announcement of who's going to be the president while we're on here for the next hour. So don't fret. The soap opera will continue after we finish this class. But again, thank you very much for joining us, and I will bring on Professor Khan. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakallah khair for again, Brother Dawood, honoring me with being part of this wonderful series, and I concur. I promise you that the vote count will not change in the next hour, inshallah. For those of you who can watch this later asynchronously, then this means nothing, so fear not. But tonight we are going to talk about a topic that certainly is very germane to not only this current election, but in many ways for us, the subject of immigration has attained a kind of specific relief because of the current administration. As you know, the administration essentially launched its campaign, as well as some of its first acts on the backs of demonizing Muslims, particularly with the so-called travel ban. And inshallah, we'll talk about that in the time that we have together. But I'd like to start off with, and I will now share my my screen here, with the history of immigration in this country. And let me see. Not sure why it's doing what it is right now. I'm sorry. I always seem to have problems with this. Let me see. Maybe that'll do it. No. Okay. Any suggestions, Brother Dawood, on how I can share my screen?
I'm not sure about how to rectify that.
I mean, it's allowing me to share it.
Yeah. I'm not sure. Well, if you're not able to share it, then you probably will have to continue this class this time without sharing slides. Let's try one more time.
Okay. I'm getting it like sort of going in a rather psychedelic way.
Yeah, it's Oregon style.
Oh wow, that just blew my mind right there.
Oh,
yeah. Let me go ahead and stop. How about if I would you like me to send them to you? Maybe you can actually then if you give me an address, I can send it to you, inshallah.
Okay, hold on. Let's see here.
I can send it to your care address.
Yeah.
Why don't I do that? Yeah, because and then I can just, if you permit me, I can just ask you to advance the slides.
Okay. Let's see if we can work this out.
Okay. Okay. That should come your way now. Let's see. Yeah, I think inshallah I think the audience will hopefully benefit from the slides as well.
Inshallah, inshallah. Okay, there we go. Slides. Thank you all for watching, for being patient with us during this technical difficulty. Okay, let's see here. Let's see if we can get this now. Okay. Wow, it's like I'm having the same. Let's see here. Oh no, here we go. Okay, it should be up now. Let's see.
Okay.
No, it says not responding.
Okay, it's not responding on your side either?
No, it's saying application window, and now my screen is toggling. I can't even. Wow. I don't know what's going on.
Okay, well, inshallah, if you don't mind, I can go ahead then and just start speaking on the slides.
Okay, no problem. I can't even get myself off the screen now.
Oh
But
boy.
go ahead.
Okay, well, hopefully there wasn't any kind of malware on there, so inshallah. So on the subject of immigration, we live in a country where one of the slogans, if you will, is that we are a nation of immigrants. And this is essentially etched into our collective consciousness, maybe even deeper than that, from the very inception of our education process in this country. It is a trope that every immigrant, him or herself, receives when upon coming to this country. Perhaps it's something that they are even accustomed to hearing before coming to this country. And of course, there are mixed emotions and mixed sentiments about this. True, it is a country of immigrants, but that, of course, is always given a rather heraldic narrative. But of course, it oftentimes comes with some rather dubious and dark elements as well, especially because it comes at the expense of so many populations, some of which were essentially wiped out via genocide. One of the most powerful of these images, of course, is one whose season is coming upon us with Thanksgiving in a few weeks. The whole notion of the so-called Pilgrims landing on Plymouth Rock in the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1620. This whole notion of coming to a land, people without a land, coming to a land without people, a very common trope which we hear in other registers and other capacities as well. Of course, that and the imagery around the Thanksgiving holiday is certainly not as amicable and as amiable as one would be led to believe. There was, of course, a lot of exploitation and even killings of the Native American population. It's also important to remember that when the first wave of European immigrants came to the Americas, this was a land, excuse me, which was already contested by different European powers, whether it was the British, whether it was the French, and then also others trying to stake claim to the land and the territory here. The Dutch, the Spanish also made a claim for that. There's also this conceit that somehow the other immigration to the Americas was a voluntary pursuit by everyone coming. Maybe they were leaving situations or conditions back home which perhaps necessitated their departure, bringing them to America. But of course, that wasn't the case for everybody either, with, of course, the Black Atlantic slave trade and the fact that this quote-unquote migration of Black Africans was anything but a voluntary decision, being stripped of their agency to go ahead and do it. But at the same time, I think it is very important to recognize that they were also part of the broader narrative of immigration, because then and only then can we understand it in its full complexity and also in its dark periods as well. Now, as it comes to the history of Islam in America, we really have several different phases of this. There was, of course, the pre-quote-unquote American era, where scholars have now been able to determine that people like under the caliphate of Abdurrahman III of Cordoba in the early part of the 10th century, of the Common Era, that there were Muslim explorers who had arrived here. Of course, when it came to Christopher Columbus and his voyages at the end of the 15th century, we have at least two Muslim captains, one of the Pinta, Martin Alonso Pinzon, and his brother Vicente Yanez Pinzon being the captain of the Nina. And of course, the third being the Santa Maria was the flagship of Columbus, along with Muslim cartographers and navigators as well. And then evidence of Estevanico of Asamor exploring Arizona and New Mexico for the Spanish Empire in the 1520s and the 1530s. That really wouldn't be considered so much immigration of Muslims here. In fact, if anything, that would probably fit rightly in the previous lecture that I gave regarding colonialism. Of course, we have the Neo-American era, which brought slaves from West Africa. But then there was also, in the first century of American history, Muslims serving in the United States military during the Civil War. So here then we find that some of the, ironically enough, earliest immigrants communities to the United States, albeit involuntarily, were Black Africans. During the 1800s, there was small-scale immigration from the Ottoman Empire and from Yemen. During the early 20th century, similarly from the former Ottoman Empire, from the Levant, places like Lebanon and Syria. Records of how many Muslims migrated, though, is always elusive for two reasons. One, because the immigration records here in the United States, and particularly when it came to census records, do not chronicle religion. And as a result of it, we're really not sure how many Christians came from that part of the world and how many of them were Muslims. Sometimes even the names are not determinative or definitive. The second reason is because passports from the Levant similarly did not necessarily place religious category or religious identity in there. So there's a certain ambiguity as to the numbers that came. And then, of course, when we have after World War II, particularly from 1965 onwards, we find the bigger thrust of immigration to this country. But it's important to recognize, again, that when it comes to particularly the Muslim population of America, be they of African-American descent or from some other part of the world, there was an immigration component to this. Now, when we take a look at American law as it pertains to immigration, here we find that there has always been some element of race and racism involved. And one of the earliest laws that was enacted was the Naturalization Act of 1790. This was intended to be a pathway to U.S. citizenship. And it said, and I quote, "Provided that any free, white, adult alien," meaning adult alien, somebody who's a foreigner, not extraterrestrial, male or female, who had resided within the limits and jurisdiction of the United States for a period of 2 years, was eligible for citizenship. Now, of course, what we find here then is something that is rather loaded, and it was certainly going to exclude others who were in the United States with quite a measure of quantity, i.e. slaves. They were completely excluded from even the possibility of being considered citizens, even though many of them were born in the United States. So irrespective of whether they were naturalizing or natural born, Black former Africans were not able to benefit from this pathway to U.S. citizenship. And even when it came to U.S. citizenship, as it says here, females would be counted as citizens. That did not necessarily mean that the rights to vote and other benefits of what we now understand intuitively to be parts of citizenship were conferred upon them. The next law that the United States passes, which is a function of, if not immigration, then what we would call xenophobia, in the midst of a fear that the country was going to go to war with France, ironically, a country that had been allied with the United States in its campaign for independence from Great Britain just a few years earlier than this, and the so-called XYZ affair, where there was, again, suspicion of foreign actors in the United States. The government passed what's known as the Alien and Seditions Acts of 1798. And 4 laws were part of these acts. And essentially what they did was they restricted aliens from entry into the United States, but they also combined this with curtailing what they regarded as excesses of an unrestrained press. And I think that this is a very important factor to consider. The way that immigration and the way that the racism and weaponization of race has played a role in the United States, that along with the xenophobia, along with the targeting of various communities, demonizing them, there's usually another agenda afoot. And this, of course, is not just the securitization of that particular group, but it is also the securitization of society as a whole. It becomes a lot easier if these measures have, at least on the banner, the specter of fear of the other. But you see here that when it comes to curtailing the so-called excesses of an unrestrained press, that is something that most so-called aliens or immigrants would be disempowered to have any control over them anyways. So this was going to be policing, ostensibly, aliens, which of course had a far smaller and lower threat to the sanctity of the United States, or at least to the state, and what its agenda was, then was the press. And this is, of course, despite the fact that the Bill of Rights and the First Amendment had been ratified only a few years before this. As we fast forward to the Civil War and this particular period of American history, on the one hand, it doesn't necessarily correlate to a discussion on immigration. This was a time when immigration was, at least on its surface, not related to the Civil War. Unless, for some of you who have either read the book or seen the movie Gangs of New York, the very excellent movie by Martin Scorsese, starring Leonardo DiCaprio and Daniel Day-Lewis, you see how immigration plays some role within the Civil War. There was a lot of turmoil, especially in the North, about whether people should join the Union Army or not, and that there were also efforts that as people were landing, literally docking their ships in New York Harbor from places like Ireland, they were immediately being offered citizenship and were being conscripted to go fight in the South on the side of the Union Army. So this whole idea about connecting citizenship as an incentivization or fast-tracking it for those who were recent immigrants was part of the historical record here in the United States. And it was, of course, also interesting in that movie that it shows this dividing line even back then between immigrants and those who saw themselves as native-borns, so-called Yankees, and the kind of bigotry and racism that was even being depicted against them. And it brings up another very interesting point, that today in the United States, one wouldn't necessarily consider the Irish to be an alien community. But in fact, in the middle of the 19th century and pretty much until the 1920s and the 1930s, the Irish were considered the other. In fact, the very excellent book by Ignatieff, How the Irish Became White, demonstrates that they were even seen as a racial other, not just an immigrant other. Fascinating lines of demarcation, and ones that we should consider moving forward as this country is going to, within 20 years, become a majority-minority country. We're already seeing the kind of recalibrations in the aftermath of this election about people self-identifying with proximity to whiteness. And that's going to be something that we're going to find that political parties are going to be paying very close attention to as there's going to be this effort to court, manipulate, and exploit in future political cycles. But back to the Civil War and its aftermath. The so-called Civil War or Reconstruction Amendments of 1868, which were ratified a mere 3 years after the conclusion of the war, do have bearing on immigration. The first, of course, deals with the outlawing of slavery explicitly in the 13th Amendment. This now essentially provides a corrective to what was denied to Black Africans and their descendants by the Naturalization Act of 1790. Now the slavery was lifted, and following up with the 14th Amendment, citizenship was granted to them, and very explicitly to say including former slaves, and guaranteeing citizens equal protection under the law. So the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment was embedded here, it was codified, and it was also extended to the states in the 14th Amendment. And then the 15th Amendment is even more emphatic, that it prohibits denying any citizens the right to vote based on race, color, or previous conditions of servitude. So the idea that just because somebody may have been a slave is not a criterion that can be used to deny anybody the right to citizenship, and more importantly, the right to vote. Now that, of course, is different from the Voting Rights Act and the controversies around that. These are maneuverings around the 15th Amendment or trying to chip away at it. Those kinds of efforts have been going on really ever since the 15th Amendment has been passed, and it's certainly something that should be of concern for quite a lot of us. When we look then at the 19th century after the Civil War, we have the Industrial Revolution start to pick up in the United States. And here we see that there are efforts to build and connect to the West. This is the new frontier, and particularly on railroads, building those all the way to California. Part of this was born of the gold rush and the zeal and the greed to try to cash in on these, the possibility of wealth and prosperity from mining gold in places like California, also lumber in places like California and Oregon and in Washington state. Cheap labor was necessary, particularly when it came to very hazardous vocations, and the Chinese became this form of cheap labor, coming in, by the thousands by boat to the West Coast. In fact, one of the terms of being shanghaied, sometimes people being simply put on boats and having them sail without necessarily knowing where they were going, has some of its origins here. It was fine for America to get the cheap labor, get everything that they wanted from these essentially beasts of burden as to how they were viewed. But once their utility was finally achieved, once the railroads had been constructed, there was no longer a need for them, and certainly not one for them to stay in the United States. The Page Act of 1875 was passed, which prohibited the importation of unfree laborers, meaning people who were coming here not under some kind of indentured servitude or contract from some of the big railroad companies, as well also prohibiting the importation of women brought for quote-unquote immoral purposes. But this law was primarily targeting the Chinese. Now, if you're wondering about what does it mean about immoral purposes, at least the letter of the law suggests that it was to stop Chinese women coming here and being prostitutes. That really wasn't the case. What they did not want was for Chinese women to come here and for families to develop between the male laborers and the Chinese women. So the easiest thing to do then is simply to go ahead and brand these women as being ones of ill repute or having immoral purpose, something that, of course, could never be proved. It also was occurring amidst this rather anti-Chinese fervor that was not just in the West Coast, but it was now starting to spread throughout the rest of the United States. So this was something that provided a firewall from what was considered xenophobia at the part of too many Chinese in this country. This was followed 7 years later by perhaps what's the more famous legislation regarding Asians, and that is the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Clearly, the Page Act was not sufficient in stopping the numbers or what they felt was the visibility of the Chinese population in the U.S. And it is the first and still only law to have been implemented to prevent all members of a specific ethnic or national group from immigrating to the United States. Now, fortunately, it has been repealed, and the U.S. Supreme Court has held that such laws are completely unconstitutional. Of course, as we'll talk about the so-called travel ban, that's one of the reasons why some countries are excluded, so it doesn't appear to be a so-called blanket ban as what happened under the Chinese Exclusion Act. That same year, another immigration act was also passed, which imposed a head tax on non-citizens of the U.S. who were coming to American ports and restricted certain classes of people from immigrating to the country, including criminals, the insane, or any person who was unable to take care of him or herself, or what was known as a likely public charge. Well, this, of course, was meant to go ahead and particularly keep people out who were destitute, who couldn't pay the head tax, and primarily these were people seen coming from places like Asia, places like Africa, and places like South America. 9 years later, another immigration act is passed. Here we find that it allows the federal government to have authority to remove aliens who had entered unlawfully, as well as also providing an expansion of categories of people who could be excludable, not just likely public charges, but people suffering from certain contagious diseases, felons, polygamists, aliens assisted by others by payment of passage. So they were even restricting people who were paying for others to migrate to the United States. Anything to then go ahead and restrict immigration in a country which clearly had the capacity and perhaps even the need for more people to come here. Moving on to the 20th century, we have in 1917, in the midst of World War I, but something that really didn't have anything to do with World War I. The Immigration Act of 1917, also known as the Asiatic Barred Zone Act. And this was aimed to restrict immigration by imposing literacy tests on immigrants and creating new categories of inadmissible persons and barring immigration as a whole from the Asia-Pacific zone. And some of the graphics and some of the political cartoons at the time, which I'm sorry I cannot show you right now, but one of them said, "Our first invasion by Hindus and Mohammedans." So quite obviously describing Muslims, saying that 6 Hong Kong's crack policemen from the Punjab have deserted and have come to work on a railroad section in San Jose, so San Jose, California. So here we find then that the kind of xenophobia was also expanding to include people from the Indian subcontinent, both Hindus as well as Muslims. When we think about immigration restrictions like the Chinese Exclusion Act, for example, people erroneously think that it was really only targeting people of East Asia, Japanese, Chinese, Koreans, etc. But it was far more pervasive than that. And at this point, as you can see, it was also affecting Muslims coming from the Pacific. 7 years later, an Immigration Act of 1924 goes further in preventing immigration from Asia. And this act also introduces something new into immigration law, which is setting quotas. Here, the quota was going to be at 2% on the number of immigrants from the Eastern Hemisphere, 2% of the population regarding what was already here in the United States. And this mechanism of national quotas was upheld by the so-called McCarran-Walter Act of 1952, as well as the ability for the government to declare as either inadmissible or as deplorable aliens from various countries. During World War II, we have one of the darker episodes of how former immigrants to the United States were treated. Japanese people of Japanese heritage who were U.S. citizens were interned in a series of 12 concentration camps. About 120,000 of them were interned for the duration of World War II after Pearl Harbor was attacked on December the 7th of 1941. Without any kind of due process rights, they were interned in places like Manzanar internment camp in California. Former actor George Takei, who played Sulu on Star Trek, in fact, spent time as a child at Manzanar. And a lawsuit was brought on behalf of Japanese American citizens for their treatment or their mistreatment. The most famous case was Korematsu versus the United States in 1944. Fred Korematsu, an American citizen, brought suit, but in a 6-3 opinion, the United States Supreme Court held that the government's actions of depriving U.S. citizens under the guise of a national security threat was completely constitutional. And perhaps what's more bothersome is that Korematsu was never, ever struck down. It is still technically valid law and precedent in constitutional law. The late Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia, somebody who was on the conservative wing of the court, in fact, quite conservative, even he, in a dissenting opinion, wrote that Korematsu was terrible law. So you see here that what may be seen as problematic is different from what is still permissible. Now, when we talk about immigration, of course, there's the condition of Hispanics and Latinos and Latinas coming to the United States, and particularly their utility as cheap labor. And in 1948, the Bracero program was enacted, which was a series of laws and diplomatic agreements between Mexico and the U.S. regarding migrant manual laborers. And this shows a lot of sophistication and actually quite a lot of influence that the Mexican government had, that it was able to engage in negotiations on behalf of its citizens who it knew were coming to the U.S. And quite frankly, the U.S. wanted them to come, but to at least go ahead and establish that they had rights when they came here. This pertained mostly to temporary and or seasonal work visas, especially in the area of agriculture, and set minimum standards of living conditions, a right to shelter, a right to proper food, and also work conditions as well to make sure that they were safe. A minimum wage, as well as anti-discrimination protections from the broader society while they were here. Which leads us then also to, of course, the very seminal 1964 Civil Rights Act. Now, of course, on its surface, people may not understand what would this law have to do with our understanding of immigration. But there are two very important takeaways. First of all, this was a law that was enacted for the protection of rights for African Americans as citizens, again, former immigrants, but it also then served to facilitate a change in immigration policy the following year with the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 that was signed into law by President Lyndon Johnson, who had also signed into law the Civil Rights Act. And this act was seen as a paradigm shift when it came to immigration. It abolishes the national origins formula, which had been the basis for U.S. immigration policy since the 1920s, putting quotas on countries. And it removed de facto discrimination against Southern and Eastern and Northwestern Europeans, as well as immigrants from Africa and from Asia. And when the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 is passed, it is from this point that we see a massive influx of immigrants from all of these areas, and particularly from Asia and from Africa. And even more specifically, here is where we see an influx of Muslims coming to the country. Now, just to show how significant this is, around the time of 1965, and well into even the 1990s, the Black American Muslim population was somewhere around 40%. Now it is, by many statistics, somewhere around 20%. So here we see then the impact of a sustained level of immigration to the United States. And in some ways, of course, it has changed the face of Islam for America. Before the 1970s and the 1980s, where we see a very large influx of immigration of Muslims from Asia, Africa, etc., the public face of Islam, at least one that was recognizable, identifiable, associated with Islam, of course, was Al-Hajj al-Malik al-Shabazz, Brother Malcolm X, as well as Muhammad Ali. Starting after that, we find that by and large, Islam in America starts to be perceived as a foreign entity and a foreign presence. Today, of course, it is much more of a mixed bag. Visibility is there for people like Rashida Tlaib, people like Ibn Hajj Muhammad, people like Sal Khan from Khan Academy, and a host of others, which reflects then the mosaic of Islam in America throughout its entire arc of immigration. But that leads us now to the very current. And as I mentioned before, we have the so-called Muslim travel bans. Then candidate Donald Trump announced in 2015, as he was announcing his candidacy for president, that he was going to call for a complete and total ban on Muslims to the United States until we can figure out what's going on, under, again, this guise of securitization. So if you think about our discussion thus far, so many of the laws that were passed under the name of immigration had with them the demonization of the immigrant groups as being the alien, foreign, other, but also then interweaving it with securitization issues, the security issues of and risks of the group itself, but then also looking at other security opportunities, if you will, in the US that would have a far broader impact, as with the Alien and Seditions Acts of 1798. So when we take a look at the Muslim travel bans from 2017 onwards, and as you well know, the Supreme Court ultimately held that the US president has the authority, according to the Second Amendment and his powers as the head of the executive branch, to make determinations in the capacity of immigration law as to whom is a threat. And of course, we saw this also during the Bush 43 administration when it came to determining unilaterally who was a so-called enemy combatant. So those kinds of powers are there. They are, of course, quite racist in their scope, or at least in their potential to be applied. And if anything, then the so-called Muslim travel bans are not really an anomaly. They are not really an exception to the arc of immigration history and immigration law in the United States. They are very much part of its fabric, going back to quite literally the foundation of the country. And I'd like to just end before, inshallah, questions, that when we think about perhaps the most dramatic and recognizable symbol of American immigration, that is the Statue of Liberty, which is in New York Harbor, although on the New Jersey side. Yes, there was even a Supreme Court case, lawsuit as to where does the Statue of Liberty lie? It was New York versus New Jersey, and the Supreme Court held that it was actually in New Jersey's waters. And we're familiar with the famous poem by Emma Lazarus about the Colossus, in which she says, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, your wretched refuse, come to my shore. But there have been political cartoons that show the Statue of Liberty saying, stay out, we're full. Others have the Statue of Liberty having all these children coming up to her, and she's saying, my children, except that these children on their backs, on their shirts, it says British, French, German, Swedish, Danish, those which are considered desirable, those which are considered undeplorable aliens. So immigration in this country has certainly been a very contested issue. It has been a very problematic issue, but of course it is one way or the other. It has been the way that all of us or our ancestors have made their way onto these shores. So Jazakallah khair for being patient with me without having the ability to see the slides. But inshallah, hopefully that provides a bit of insight and introduction to a very complex question. I will actually, if you permit me, I'll just list some books which may help provide greater insight than what I can. There is the excellent and very short book, Muslims in America by Edward E. Curtis IV. There is a History of Islam in America by Kambiz Ghanea Basri. There is Assimilation in American Life by Milton Gordon. This is a seminal work in sociology which talks about immigrants and the compulsion they feel to assimilate with various models, one being Anglo-conformity, one being the melting pot model, and one being the mixed salad model. Another book by the late Suleiman Yang, rahimullah, Islam in the United States of America. And then a couple of books on immigration in general. One is by really one of the best immigration scholars in the U.S., A Different Mirror, A History of Multicultural America by Ronald Takaki. And then a more recent book called The Dark Side, Immigrants, Racism, and the American Way by Young Park. And inshallah, I can forward these to Brother Dawood and make them available if anybody would like the names and the titles of these books. So Jazakallah khair.
Thank you very much for your presentation. And for those of you who have questions, you can go ahead and put those in the chat. Unfortunately, I'm having some technical difficulties, so whatever questions you type, I'm going to have to read those and not put those. I won't have the opportunity to put those on the screen to be viewed by Professor Khan. I would like to also reiterate one book he mentioned, which I mentioned last week in the class on the social construction of whiteness, is that book, How the Irish Became White. I think that is a fundamental read for us who are interested in this, the construct of whiteness and how it has expanded. The issue of aspirational whiteness, I think that it would help to inform that, and even as far as the current political situation that we have now, where there is, and for instance, the Latino community has never been monolithic, but we can even see right now what Trump has been doing is trying to make a distinction and pandering more towards what would be considered the white Latinos, or those who have predominance of not claiming to have pure Spanish blood, which we forget that Spain is in Europe, and then with the native or the indigenous Latinos, as well as those who would be considered Creole, or those Latinos who are Afro-Latinos who have a mixture of Spanish African and or Spanish African and indigenous blood. So there is, we can see the politics of that going on right now, and probably be the expansion of whiteness, where we can probably see that there'll be some further expansion of whiteness to include people like that, and being Latino or Latinx will be redefined. Are there any other are there any questions that come from the audience? I had to step away for a moment, Professor Khan, because I heard something in the front door. I didn't know if there was a MAGA out there or not, so I had to check. But and I'm being serious about that too, by the way.
Oh yeah,
I wasn't joking. If you could, I'm not sure if you missed this, if you went over this or not, but did you touch on anything about how because you mentioned Asiatic and really that area, the former Ottoman Empire, about how that got redubbed, those people from there being Asiatic, but this changing of the construct of whiteness, of how Arabs at one time were considered to be whites, and then they got labeled to be non-whites, and then got to be labeled again as whites for immigration purposes, but never fully socially, politically white. If you didn't expand, if you didn't talk about that, could you kind of flesh that out for the viewing audience right now?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, it really dovetails on what you were just describing regarding the Latinx community. If anything, the test case, or one of the test cases for that, was the former Ottoman territory and people migrating from that. And here we see that a lot of political consideration, a lot of political exploitation for the needs of the power structure here, then was a matter of how expedient it would be to include a certain group, and even to use those as lines of demarcation within those who were migrating from a certain place. So those who seem to be more visibly or demonstrably, quote unquote, passing for white, were able to do so, especially those who were lighter skinned, lighter eyed, people who may have been Circassian, for example. It is no coincidence that some of those who came from the former Balkans, Albanians, for example, and some from places like Bosnia, they had a far easier ability and path to integration in the United States than would be the sort of, for lack of better terms, the swarthier people coming here. I'm always struck by, when I was younger, reading the book The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, which is a fascinating social commentary on the harsh treatment of particularly Eastern European immigrants to the United States working in the slaughterhouses on the south side of Chicago. Many of them were from places like Lithuania and from Poland, and they would have been seen like the Irish as being not fully white. They would have been certainly darker, maybe not so much darker complected, but darker hair, darker eyes. They would have been Catholic or Russian Orthodox, so they would have been outside the pale of the Protestant essentialism of American religious identity. At the same time, when it came to the so-called Arab population coming here, religion also played a role. So those who found an easier pathway to be accepted as white generally had lobbying on their behalf or patronage on their behalf from churches. So Maronite Christians, Malachites, Copts, those who were less foreign, or if you will, fit more nicely and more conveniently into the white man's burden to say that there is some kind of fraternity that exists with these communities, we will then go ahead and bring them in. And as a result of it, it bolsters our numbers. It also creates a kind of a dependency that these communities then are wedded to us because of the beneficence that we've supposedly shown them. This has been almost like a food processor churning its way throughout American history. And as you aptly put it, we are heading into this situation again, not just with the Latinx community, but we're also seeing this when it comes to the elements of the Muslim community as well, particularly some of these debates this past year when it came to the U.S. Census. Should there be the demand for a separate category marked Arab for those who would like to self-identify? There already is a difference when it came to the census and many other forms, that if you are of Indian origin, meaning Indian Asian, you might come under what is called Asia. Which then runs the risk of coming into this broader category called Asian Pacific Islander. How much does a South Asian have in common with somebody from the Pacific Rim, let alone somebody from, say, Samoa or one of the islands in Oceania? At the same time, Pakistan was considered to not be Asian Pacific Islander. This has a lot to do with political machinations. This has a lot to do with lobbying. It has, of course, a lot to do with money as well. People who want to distinguish themselves from a group. But any of these discussions have to be taken as what I like to use as a metaphor, a balloon. If you squeeze one end, then it makes the other end expand. And if you squeeze that end, then the other end expands. This is part of an ebb and flow. There is no movement from the status quo that does not have a cost-benefit analysis to it. So on the one hand, there are certainly some benefits that people could see, and in fact, that might be what motivates them to take a certain action. For example, incline toward being considered a white in America. But there's always an opportunity cost, and sometimes that opportunity cost is not apparent at that very moment. At the very least, they may simply get played. The idea that there are always forces with bigger pockets, with bigger pay grades, for those who are simply engaging and indulging in what they think is the table scraps at the proverbial table, has to be considered as we move forward, because the pressures are really going to start moving. After all, by 2040, it is estimated that the plurality of this country is going to be non-white. And the countdown has already begun, and it began about a decade ago. In the last census of 2010, it already showed that the number of non-white births was outpacing that of white births. And in 2013, the Pew Center for the Study of Religious Life said that the first time in American history, the number of, we're no longer a majority Protestant country. We are predominantly either Catholic or non-affiliated. That accounts for 60% of the population. So it's quite telling then that the so-called white Anglo-Saxon Protestant essentialism for many, or that what they perceive as being the quintessential American identity, is starting to erode, becoming less white and more brown, less Anglo-Saxon and perhaps more Latin American, less Protestant and more Catholic or something else. And the repercussions then are that the current majority is not only feeling just beyond a chill, but they're feeling an actual seizure. You see these moral panics that are emerging throughout the country, including what we have been seeing with the rather toxic rhetoric of white supremacy, white nationalism. They will not replace us. All of this really fits into then what I would suggest are these moral panics, and a realization that America is changing irrevocably, irreversibly in a particular direction. The two mechanisms and the two strategies that that particular group will have, one is to try to confront either by violence or other means, legislatively or by policy, to try to disenfranchise those that don't fit that identity. Or the other, which is perhaps even more dangerous because of how subtle it can be and seemingly charitable and altruistic, is trying to co-opt certain elements and groups. And why this is dangerous is two things. First of all, it is rather ephemeral, it is rather cynical. And the other is the corrosive effect it's going to have on the intra-communal dynamics. This is going to be a way that it creates fissures and cleavages among communities that can ill afford to have them because they already are sitting on a very fragile existence in this country.
Thank you for that very thorough explanation. As you were talking, I thought of two things, and especially goes to the history of this issue of whiteness. And in particular, in the Arab American community, it was those from the Levant, Greater Syria at the time, who were lobbying to be included to be white, especially we're talking about light, very light-skinned people from Syria and Lebanon in particular. I remember reading one case that one of the arguments, and I want to break this down because it has contemporary significance, that an argument was made in one particular case that people from the Levant should be considered white because Jesus was born in the Levant. And therefore, if you're saying that we're not white, then you're saying that Jesus Christ is not white. So, these types of arguments of aspirational whiteness, we have to look at one, what is a group willing to give up to be accepted into the broader nothingness of whiteness, right? There's a certain social political advantage that could be gotten, but then what do you lose in the process? It could be your heritage, I mean, also even your religion, because white people who've been in America for a few generations, they no longer have any ties really strongly to the culture and to their language of back home. They're just white, right? So number one, and it's not to be insulting, but for those of you who may be watching this live or in its entirety, who maybe have very light skin, light eyes, light hair, you're from Syria or from Lebanon, and you could be so-called white passing, what are you willing to give up? And what type of ancestor do you want to be known as to do that? Then also in the construct of whiteness, and we're talking about immigration and people coming here, but when people come to America and get absorbed into whiteness, it's not just what you give up in the aspirational whiteness, but also to whose detriment is that? So we're talking about a cost-benefit analysis. We also have to make an analysis of, if it's benefiting me, then who is it going to harm? And historically in America, there's two groups in particular, with the expansion of whiteness or people asserting their whiteness is predominantly been to the detriment of African Americans and indigenous Americans, or so-called Native Americans, who then become the primary people who don't benefit, who actually is to their detriment of this expansion. So we have to really ask ourselves as Muslims, that we're here, especially those who are immigrants or come from that background, that this whole idea of the American dream, what does that really mean? And are we willing to divest from certain aspirations that we have in order for us to be truly Muslim, and to hopefully hold on to some of our cultural heritage in a healthy way, and not just lose it in the sea of nothingness?
Well, there's that. I mean, as Mashallah, you so articulately stated, there's also this issue that we have to be mindful that as immigrants, with the perpetuation of that mindset that we're not fully from or located here, we're not only then subject to the suspicions and the otherization by power structures in America. But we become the proverbial chum on the water for those Muslims elsewhere in the world who are seeking to perhaps reestablish centers of gravity for their own political purposes, and then see how they will try to exploit a people who they feel are vulnerable, of not centered or settled, to then tip the balance for what may be their agendas under the auspices of exploiting religious identity. And these become then incredibly important, particularly for our younger generations, who, thanks to globalization, thanks to technology, thanks to the kinds of advancements in communication, so many of these barriers have been broken. And for them to then become decentered in how they see themselves, as then becoming, even for those who are natural born in America, who, as you said, in other communities, 4 generations in, they have no sense of being from somewhere else. They are American. We're having a situation where 4 or 5 generations in, Muslim Americans still don't feel as though they are here. That immigrant mindset is still so embedded in their consciousness, in their thinking, in their identity, and in their vulnerability. So the challenges then are the exploitation from within, because they don't have a strong sense of self about being American, and the fact that they then become pliant to other forces from outside.
Yes, that's very well articulated, and without going into any specifics, that has been a ongoing problem, including right now that you just articulated, and it plays itself out in our community priorities politically, and it has influences on various ways over different institutions. Unfortunately, if there are no questions from the audience, we're going to close out. Next week, we will be back, God willing, at 7 p.m., and we will be going over Jim Crow, from Jim Crow to legalized desegregation. From Jim Crow to legalized desegregation. And we use the term desegregation on purpose and not integration, because America is, as I think maybe you mentioned before, or I heard earlier today, actually it was yesterday, actually I was on, but schools in America are just as segregated between Black and white in America as they were in the late 1960s. That has not changed. The amount, as well as the segregation by zip code, our country has not fundamentally changed in the last 50 years as far as segregation of certain groups of people based upon a zip code. So we want to talk about that. And I think, again, it just goes to show too, as I mentioned yesterday on a talk with interfaith leaders, that racism cannot be simply legislated nor adjudicated away, because we have to deal with the issue of cultural racism, and what informs cultural racism at its roots is really, we're talking about diseases of the heart, as well as ignorance, right? So you can't legislate away ignorance, and no amount of court cases is going to do away with ignorance and arrogance and envy and those sorts of things. But this isn't meant to be a khutbah. So we will conclude with that. But again, thank you very much, Professor Khan. And also, as advice to those of you who are following the election results, be patient. I would suggest that, unless it's part of your profession, to be a commentator or a media pundit or someone who speaks on this, that try to watch something else or read a book, read the Quran, and don't spend all day and all night glued to the TV. As tempting as that might be, there are other things that you can do with your time that's not going to speed up the process of votes being counted. So do yourself a favor and read Sotul Kaf and get some sleep tonight. And when you wake up in the morning, there probably is not going to be anyone declared to be president. And so go ahead and get some sleep tonight and don't tire yourselves out, please. Thank you very much. And we will conclude with this class. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Assalamu alaikum.